The morning Eleanor Harper walked into Hayes Farm Equipment, the March sun was just beginning to warm the blacktop parking lot. She drove a faded blue Ford F-100 with rust blooming along the wheel wells, the kind of truck that announced its arrival with a diesel rattle 3 blocks away. The lot was full of new machinery, green paint gleaming under fluorescent lights visible through the showroom windows. A John Deere 4440 sat center stage with a price tag that could buy 2 houses in town. Ellie cut the engine and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. 40 years old and 2 years a widow, she wore her late husband's flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her jeans were patched at one knee. Her blonde hair, showing the first threads of gray, was pulled back in a ponytail that hadn't seen a salon in 18 months. In the passenger seat, Rebecca sat clutching a rag doll with yarn hair, 3 years old, and already learning that silence sometimes meant safety. The dealership door chimed when they entered. The showroom smelled like new paint and motor oil and money. Brandon Hayes stood behind the parts counter, 27 years old, in a crisp polo shirt with the John Deere logo stitched over his heart. He was sorting invoices when he looked up, and his eyes did what men's eyes always did, swept from Ellie's face to her hands to her boots and back again, cataloging and dismissing in the span of a breath. Brandon set down his clipboard. His smile was the kind salesman practiced in mirrors. "Can I help you, ma'am?" Ellie's voice came out steady, the way she'd trained it to sound since Richard died. "Need a drawbar pin for a Farmall 806. Brandon's expression shifted just slightly. His eyebrows lifted. "International Harvester. That's right. 1965 model." He leaned against the counter, arms crossed, the smile turning into something else, something that looked almost like pity. "Ma'am, are you sure you need that? Maybe your hired hand should come in, and I don't have a hired hand. I farm it myself." The words landed between them like stones dropped in still water. Brandon's face went through a series of small adjustments, working out whether she was serious, whether this was some kind of joke. Behind him, another salesman had stopped what he was doing to listen. "Mrs. Harper, with all due respect, a widow can't run 320 acres alone. You should think about selling while land prices are still good. I could put you in touch with a realtor who specializes in." Ellie felt Becca's hand tighten around hers. The little girl was staring up at the man behind the counter with wide eyes, not understanding the words, but reading the tone the way children always could. Ellie squeezed back once, gentle. "Just need the pin." Brandon straightened, the pretense of helpfulness falling away. "Mrs. Harper, women don't belong on tractors. That's dangerous work. Heavy machinery, long hours, equipment that can kill you if you make one mistake. Your husband? God rest him, he'd want you to find someone to take this over. Remarry. Find a man who knows what he's doing." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Ellie could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead, could hear Becca's breathing beside her, could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She thought about all the things she could say, all the arguments she could make, all the ways she could defend herself. But defending yourself to someone who'd already decided you were wrong was like trying to bail water with a bucket full of holes. "How much for the pin?" Brandon's jaw worked. $8.65. Ellie pulled a worn leather wallet from her back pocket and counted out $9. Brandon took it without looking at her, made change without speaking, dropped the coins into her palm like he was afraid to touch her skin. He walked to the parts bins in the back and returned with a small paper bag. The pin rattled inside when he set it on the counter. "You know, we could get you into a nice 4640, reasonable monthly payments, modern equipment with a cab air conditioning, power steering. Technology's moved on since 1965. That old tractor's almost 20 years old now. Parts are getting harder to find, and when something breaks, the tractor runs fine. I just need the pin." Brandon shook his head the way you'd shake your head at a child who insisted on touching a hot stove. "I see this all the time. People hanging on to old iron thinking they're saving money. Then one day that tractor throws a rod and suddenly they're scrambling, can't get parts fast enough, crops sitting in the field. They end up paying more in the long run." Ellie picked up the bag. Becca was pulling on her hand now, ready to leave, picking up on the tension the way smoke rises. Ellie looked at Brandon Hayes, really looked at him, saw the certainty in his face, the absolute conviction that he knew better, that his way was the only way. She wondered what it felt like to be that sure of anything. "Thank you for your help." She turned toward the door, Becca's hand in hers. Behind her, Brandon called out one more time. "Mrs. Harper, that 806 is a dinosaur. It's worth maybe $3,000 in trade if I'm being generous. You're sitting on a depreciating asset. Think about what I said." Outside, the air tasted like spring, coming like thawed earth and diesel exhaust. Ellie opened the truck door and lifted Becca into the passenger seat, buckled her in, climbed behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking just slightly. She gripped the steering wheel until they stopped. Becca looked up at her solemn. "Mommy, why was that man mean?" Ellie started the engine. "Some people don't think women can do things, baby. We're going to prove them wrong." The drive home took 20 minutes through farmland just starting to green up. Ellie watched the fields roll past, saw the fence lines that marked property boundaries, saw the tractors sitting idle in machine sheds waiting for planting season. Most of them were new or new enough, green paint that still shone, cabs with glass windows, equipment that cost more than her house. She thought about Richard, about the last thing he'd said to her before the accident. They'd been standing in the kitchen, early morning coffee still hot in their mugs. He'd been worried about money, about whether they could afford new tires for the 806, whether they should take out a loan to expand. Ellie had said no. She'd said they didn't need more land, didn't need more debt, didn't need anything except what they already had. Richard had looked at her the way he always did when she was right, and he knew it, half grateful, half frustrated that she saw things so clearly. He'd kissed her forehead, told her she was smarter than him, told her to keep the books the way she'd been keeping them, tight and clean and honest. Then he'd gone out to the field and the power takeoff shaft had caught his jacket sleeve, and that was the end of everything except the promises he'd left behind. 2 years now. 730 days of people telling her to sell, to quit, to find someone else to take care of things. 730 days of proving she could do it herself. The farmhouse came into view, white paint peeling in places, a barn that needed new shingles, a machine shed where the Farmall 806 sat waiting. Home looked smaller every time she saw it, like it was shrinking under the weight of everything she had to do. But it was hers. Hers and Becca's. No bank owned it. No one could take it away. Ellie pulled into the gravel drive and cut the engine. Becca was already unbuckling herself, ready to run inside and play. But Ellie sat for a moment longer, looking at the tractor visible through the shed's open door. Red paint faded to pink in places, one front tire with cracks spreading like old scars. Chrome exhaust stack still gleaming because she polished it every week. The 806 had belonged to Richard, and before that to his father, and before that it had been new in 1965 when men walked on the moon and believed anything was possible. Inside the house smelled like wood smoke and yesterday's pot roast. Ellie made Becca a sandwich, poured milk, watched her daughter eat while spring light slanted through the kitchen window. The calendar on the wall showed March 1978 in neat squares each day, marked with reminders when to change the oil, when to check the hydraulics, when to start thinking about seed corn. No dates for movies or restaurants or anything that cost money they didn't need to spend. After lunch, while Becca napped, Ellie walked out to the shed. The 806 sat where Richard had parked it 2 years ago, the morning of the accident. She'd moved it a few times since then, to mow, to pull the manure spreader, to teach herself how to operate what had always been his domain. But mostly it sat patient and silent, waiting for her to be ready. She climbed into the seat. The metal was cold even through her jeans. The steering wheel was cracked in 3 places from decades of sun and use. She put her hands where Richard's hands had been, felt the grooves worn smooth by his palms. The dashboard was simple oil pressure temperature fuel. Nothing complicated. Nothing she couldn't understand. But understanding and doing were different things. Richard had made it look easy, the way he'd shift gears without looking, the way he'd back up the grain wagon in one smooth motion, the way he'd work 14 hours and come in for dinner like it was nothing. Ellie had watched him for 20 years, had helped during harvest, had learned to drive the tractor in straight lines across the field. But she'd never learned the things he'd known in his bones: how to rebuild an engine, how to weld a broken shaft, how to diagnose a problem by sound alone. That was before she had to. The evening Walter Freeman came over changed everything. It was June 1976, 3 weeks after Richard's funeral, and Ellie was in the barn trying to figure out why the 806 wouldn't start. She'd checked the fuel, checked the battery, checked everything she knew to check. But the engine just turned over and over, grinding and clicking and refusing to catch. Walter was 70 years old, a widower himself, farming the section next to hers. He knocked on the barn door frame, even though the door was open the way polite people did in the country. His face was weathered to leather, his hands thick with arthritis, but his eyes were sharp. Eleanor. Heard you were having trouble. Ellie wiped her hands on a rag that was already black with grease. Won't start. I've tried everything. Walter walked to the tractor, put his hand on the hood the way you'd put your hand on a horse's neck. Mind if I take a look? She stepped back, watching him work. He opened the fuel line, checked for air bubbles, closed it again, adjusted something on the carburetor, climbed into the seat and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then rumbled to life, settling into the familiar diesel rhythm that sounded like a heartbeat. Walter climbed down, let the engine idle. Air in the fuel line. Common problem. You have to bleed it out. Ellie felt something tight in her chest loosen just a fraction. How he showed her. Patient, methodical, treating her like someone who could learn instead of someone who should give up. When he was done, he wiped his hands on his own rag and looked at her straight. Eleanor, can you even drive this thing? The question hung between them. Ellie thought about lying, thought about saying yes, thought about protecting her pride. But Walter Freeman had known Richard since they were boys, had been at the funeral, had brought casseroles and condolences and quiet respect. He deserved the truth. Richard taught me. I've driven it every harvest for 20 years, but I've never maintained it, never fixed anything, never did the things he did. Walter nodded like he'd expected that answer. Your husband was a good man, good farmer, but he'd want Becca safe. He'd want you to think about selling, moving to town, finding work that doesn't require Ellie. Cut him off. Her voice harder than she meant it to be. This land is Becca's legacy, her grandfather's and her father's and now hers. I'm not selling. Walter studied her face for a long moment. The tractor rumbled between them, filling the silence. Finally he spoke. Then I'll teach you what Richard didn't have time to teach. But you have to understand this isn't easy work. It's not safe work. You'll get hurt. You'll fail. You'll want to quit. And if you do, that's not weakness. That's just knowing your limits. Ellie felt tears prickling but refused to let them fall. What if I don't have limits? Walter almost smiled. Then you'll be the first farmer I ever met who didn't. He came 3 times a week that summer. Taught her to change oil, to grease fittings, to check tire pressure and belt tension, and 100 other small things that added up to keeping a machine running. He taught her to weld standing behind her while sparks flew and metal fused her hands, shaking in the heavy gloves until she got the feel of it. He taught her to read the equipment manuals that Richard had kept in the shop, thick books full of diagrams and part numbers and troubleshooting guides. But more than that, he taught her to see the tractor not as Richard's machine, but as hers. To understand that it didn't care who drove it, as long as someone knew what they were doing. To stop apologizing for being a woman in a man's world and start proving she belonged there. By fall of 1976, Ellie could change a tire by herself. By spring of 1977, she could diagnose most common problems. By the time she walked into Hayes Farm Equipment in March 1978, she'd rebuilt the hydraulic pump, replaced the clutch, and put 1,500 hours on the 806 without once calling for help. But knowing how to fix a tractor and being accepted by the people who sold tractor parts were 2 different things. The feed store in town treated her like a curiosity. The co-op gave her credit only after she paid cash for 6 months straight. The equipment dealers looked at her the way Brandon Hayes had looked at her, like she was playing dress-up in her dead husband's clothes. Like any day now, she'd realize this was too hard and go back to where women belonged. She didn't blame them exactly. Millbrook, Iowa in 1978 was not a place where women farmed alone. It was a place where women kept the books, cooked the meals, raised the children, and left the land to the men who knew it. Ellie understood the rules even if she refused to follow them. Understanding cost her nothing. Breaking the rules cost her everything except her dignity. The Caldwells lived a mile down the road, and Vernon Caldwell was everything Ellie was not. Ambitious, expanding, leveraging equity to buy more land, more equipment, more of everything. His wife Diane wore clothes from Des Moines department stores and drove a Buick that still had dealer plates. Their kids went to private school in Cedar Rapids. Their machine shed could hold 8 tractors and looked like it belonged to a corporate farm. Vernon had 2 John Deere 430s, both bought new in 1977. He'd added 320 acres that same year, borrowed against the 640 he already owned, and the bank had been happy to write the check. Everyone said Vernon Caldwell was the future of farming, big operations, economy of scale, modern thinking. Everyone said small farmers like Ellie were relics of a dying past. It was July 1979 when Vernon and Diane stopped by on their way back from church. Ellie was in the garden pulling weeds, Becca playing in the dirt nearby, both of them sweaty and grass-stained and happy. Vernon's Buick pulled up and they got out looking like catalog models. Sunday clothes still crisp despite the heat. Diane spoke first, her voice bright and false. "Eleanor, we've been meaning to talk to you." Ellie wiped her hands on her jeans and stood. "About what?" Vernon cleared his throat. "Ellie, you're working yourself to death out here. A woman shouldn't be farming alone. It's too much. Too dangerous. What happens if you get hurt? Who takes care of Becca?" "I'm careful." Diane stepped closer, lowering her voice like they were sharing secrets. "We're worried about you. The whole church is. You're out here every day in the sun working like a hired hand. It's not right. Vernon could manage your land along with ours. You'd get a share of the profits. You could move to town, get a job in an office, let Becca have a normal childhood." Ellie looked at them. Really looked. Saw the concern that was real and the condescension that was realer. Saw the way they'd already decided what was best for her, what she should do, how she should live. She thought about the numbers in her ledger at home, the ones she updated every week. Thought about the money she saved by not having payments, by fixing things herself, by living on what she grew instead of buying what she wanted. "I appreciate the concern, but I don't want profits that come with debt attached." Vernon's expression shifted. "That's depression thinking, Eleanor. This is 1979. The economy's strong. Land values are up. You have to leverage what you have to get ahead. I'm running 640 acres now, looking to add more. That's how you stay competitive." "And how much do you owe?" Vernon blinked. That's business. You borrow when rates are low, expand when markets are high. Every farmer knows that." Ellie kept her voice level, but she felt Becca pressing against her leg, sensing tension. "Becca will inherit this land debt-free. Can you say the same about your kids?" The words landed like a slap. Diane's smile vanished. Vernon's face went red, then pale. They stood there in the July heat, the smell of fresh-turned earth between them, and something broke that couldn't be fixed with apologies. Vernon turned without another word, climbed into his Buick, started the engine. Diane followed, moving stiffly in her church heels. The car backed out of the driveway, throwing gravel, and Ellie watched them go, feeling something that wasn't quite victory and wasn't quite regret. Becca looked up at her. "Are they mad?" Ellie crouched down, brushed dirt off her daughter's cheek. "Some people don't like hearing the truth, baby, but that doesn't make it less true." That night, after Becca was asleep, Ellie sat at the kitchen table with her ledger open. Numbers in neat columns, income and expenses, every dollar accounted for. She made $32,000 a year farming 320 acres. After taxes, seed fuel equipment, maintenance, property taxes, and living expenses, she saved about $8,000. In 3 years, she'd saved $24,000. Not enough to expand, not enough to buy new equipment, but enough to know she could survive anything except debt. She thought about Vernon with his 640 acres and his 2 new tractors. Thought about the payments he was making, the interest he was paying, the bet he was placing, that prices would stay high and rates would stay low. Thought about what would happen if he was wrong. The problem with betting was that someone always lost. Walter Freeman died in December 1987, and at the funeral half the county showed up to pay respects. Ellie sat in the second pew with Becca, who was 12 now and growing into the kind of girl who asked questions instead of accepting answers. During the service, Becca leaned over and whispered, "Did Mr. Freeman have any family?" Ellie shook her head. "Wife died in 73. No children. What happens to his farm?" "Goes to auction. Estate sale." Becca was quiet for a moment, processing. "Can we buy it?" Ellie looked at her daughter, surprised. "With what money?" "You said we have savings. You said we always save." She was right, of course. Ellie had been saving for 11 years now, living on what they needed and banking the rest. The ledger at home showed $60,000 in the account money that earned interest but didn't grow crops. Money that could buy land if the price was right. We'll see. 3 months later, in March 1988, Walter's 160 acres went up for sale. The estate wanted $60,000 cash, no financing, quick close. Most farmers couldn't do it, they were leveraged to the limit, already couldn't raise cash without borrowing more. But Ellie could. She wrote a check that emptied her savings and bought the land that bordered hers, doubling her operation to 480 acres. Vernon Caldwell heard about it at the grain elevator and came by that evening standing in her driveway with his hands in his pockets. His two 443s sat in his shed a mile away, both still shining, both still making payments. "Didn't know you had that kind of money, Eleanor." Ellie was greasing the 806, Becca handing her tools like a surgical assistant. "Saved it. For 11 years. For as long as it took." Vernon shook his head. "You could have been earning returns on that. Could have invested it, leveraged it, made it work for you. Instead, you just let it sit." Ellie wiped her hands. "It didn't just sit. It gave me options. Gave me the chance to buy Walter's land when everyone else was maxed out." She watched him process that. Watched him do the math. Watched him realize that while he'd been expanding on credit, she'd been saving in silence. His face went through a series of adjustments, landing somewhere between respect and resentment. "Well, congratulations." He left and Becca looked up at her mother. "Was that weird?" Ellie smiled. That was a man learning that fast doesn't always beat slow. But 1980 came before any of that came before Walter died and before Ellie bought his land. 1980 was when Becca turned 5 and started asking questions that had no easy answers. Questions about fathers and death and why their house was smaller than everyone else's. Questions Ellie answered as honestly as she could while her daughter sat in the workshop handing her wrenches and learning the names of parts. It was a cold evening in November, winter coming on early, when Ellie was replacing the hydraulic pump on the 806. The work was delicate, required steady hands and careful attention, and Becca sat on an overturned bucket watching her mother's every move. "Mommy, why don't we have a daddy like other kids?" The question hit like a fist to the sternum. Ellie's hands stilled on the wrench, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She'd known this was coming, had rehearsed answers in her head, but none of them felt adequate when faced with her daughter's earnest face. "Your daddy's watching from heaven, baby, and he's proud of us." Becca thought about that, swinging her legs. "Are you sad?" Ellie set down the wrench and wiped her hands, buying time. "Sometimes. But then I look at you and I know we'll be okay. Because we have each other. Because we have each other. And because we have this land. And because your daddy taught me to be strong even when I don't feel strong." Becca jumped down from the bucket and wrapped her arms around Ellie's waist, fierce and certain. "I think you're the strongest person in the world." Ellie held her daughter, felt the weight of responsibility and love and fear all tangled together. She thought about all the people who said she couldn't do this, who said a woman alone couldn't farm, couldn't raise a child, couldn't survive. She thought about Brandon Hayes and his condescension about Vernon Caldwell and his pity about the bank officers and equipment dealers and feed store clerks who treated her like an oddity. Then she thought about the 806 running strong, about the 480 acres she'd soon own, about the money in her savings account and the zero in the debt column. She thought about Becca growing up watching her mother fix things and plant things and refuse to quit. "Baby, I need you to remember something. Can you do that?" Becca nodded against her shirt. "Never owe what you can't pay back. Ever. Because the minute you owe someone, you're working for them instead of yourself. This land is ours, not the bank's, ours. And that means we're free. What's free mean? It means we decide. We choose. We don't have to ask permission or make payments or worry about someone taking it away." Becca pulled back, looking up with solemn eyes. "I like being free." Ellie felt tears threaten but pushed them down. "Me too, baby. Me too." The world turned. Seasons changed. Becca grew. The 806 kept running. And in 1981, everything started to crack. It began with whispers: interest rates climbing, inflation, rising, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker trying to break the back of an economy spiraling out of control. Farmers who'd borrowed at 7% saw their loans adjust to 10, then 12, then 15. Land values that had been climbing for a decade started to plateau, then dip, then fall. Vernon Caldwell stopped by in October 1981, and this time he wasn't smiling. His Buick had been traded for a Ford pickup, and his Sunday clothes had been replaced with work jeans. He looked older, thinner, like worry had carved away everything soft. "Eleanor, can we talk?" They sat on her porch watching Becca play in the yard. Vernon's hands shook when he lit a cigarette. "My loans are adjusting up. Started at 8%, now they're at 15. Bank says they might hit 18 by spring." Ellie didn't say anything, just waited. "I owe $220,000. At 18%, that's $40,000 a year in interest alone. I can't make it, not with corn prices where they are. How much do you need to clear this year? Vernon laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Need to gross $90,000 just to cover payments and living expenses. After that, I might have $5,000 left, if prices hold, if yields are good, if nothing breaks. Can you refinance? He shook his head. Land values are dropping. Bank won't lend against falling collateral. I'm trapped. Can't sell because no one's buying. Can't refinance because the equity's gone. Can't pay because the interest is too damn high. Ellie felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are you going to do? Vernon looked at her, and his eyes were desperate. I don't know. But you don't have loans. You're going to be okay. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation and an admission and a plea all at once. Ellie thought about all the times Vernon had looked down on her, all the times he'd suggested she sell, all the times he'd implied she was too small, too cautious, too stuck in the past. She could have said something cruel, could have reminded him that she'd warned him, could have let him feel the full weight of being wrong. Instead, she said the only true thing there was to say. I hope you make it through this, Vernon. He stood crushing out his cigarette. Yeah, me too. But she could see in his face that he already knew he wouldn't. The call came at 3 in the morning in December 1982. Ellie jerked awake, heart pounding, reached for the phone in the dark. Vernon's voice crackled through the receiver, barely holding together. Eleanor, I'm sorry to call so late. Can we talk? Now I can't sleep. Haven't slept in weeks. Can I come over? Ellie sat up, pulling on a robe. Come on. 20 minutes later, headlights swept across her kitchen window. Vernon climbed out of his truck, shoulders hunched against the cold, and Ellie met him at the door. She put coffee on without asking. Set 2 mugs on the table, waited. Bank's calling my notes. All of them. Want me to pay down the principal by April or they'll foreclose. How much? $140,000. Ellie felt the number settle like a stone in her chest. Can you raise it? Vernon's hands wrapped around the coffee mug, knuckles white. I've got maybe $18,000 in cash. Everything else is tied up. Equipment, land, seed for spring. I sell any of it, I can't farm. I can't make payments. It's a death spiral. What does the bank say? Sell. Liquidate. They've got 40-50 farmers in the same situation. They don't care anymore. Federal examiners are breathing down their necks. They just want their money back. Where will you go, Cedar Rapids? My brother-in-law's got a factory job lined up. Production line. Diane can work at a grocery store. We'll make it. Just won't be farming. Vernon looked up and Ellie saw tears tracking down his weathered face. You were right, Eleanor. I thought you were stuck in the past. I remember telling you 2 years ago you were leaving money on the table, said you could double your operation. I was so sure. So damn sure that debt was smart, that leverage was the way forward. And you just kept saying no. We all did what made sense at the time. No. Vernon's voice was raw. You did what made sense. I did what felt good. Big tractors, new equipment, everybody seeing me as successful. I wanted to be one of the big operators. Wanted people to drive by and see I'd made it. Turns out I made it right into bankruptcy. Ellie reached across the table, put her hand over his. I'm sorry, Vernon. I really am. How did you know? How did a woman farming alone know better than all of us men who'd been doing this our whole lives? The question hung in the kitchen, honest and brutal. Ellie thought about the answer, about all the complicated truths that didn't fit in simple explanations. She thought about Richard dying and leaving her with no safety net, about being a woman in a world that didn't believe women could farm, about having no room for mistakes because mistakes meant losing everything. Because I couldn't afford to be wrong. You men had safety nets, family to fall back on, other jobs, options. I didn't. So I had to be right the first time and every time after that. Vernon pulled his hand back, wiped his face. His coffee had gone cold. Auctions set for May 10th. Everything goes. Tractors, combined planter trucks, tools. Land selling separately to some venture capital firm out of Des Moines. Corporate farm. They don't care about legacy or family or any of that. Just yield per acre and return on investment. Ellie felt fury rise in her chest, hot and fierce. That's not right. It's what's happening. All over Iowa. All over the Midwest. Family farms going under corporations, buying them up for pennies on the dollar. Guess that's progress. He stood, leaving his coffee untouched. I just wanted to tell you. You've been a good neighbor, Eleanor. Better than I deserved. He extended his hand and Ellie took it. Felt the bones and calluses and defeat. If you need anything between now and then, you let me know. I will. But they both knew he wouldn't. Pride was sometimes all a person had left. After Vernon drove away, Ellie sat alone in her kitchen. The clock on the wall read 4:30. Outside, darkness still held the world. She thought about making more coffee, thought about going back to bed, thought about all the farmers in all the counties facing the same impossible math. Footsteps on the stairs made her turn. Becca stood in the doorway, 7 years old, in flannel pajamas, hair mussed from sleep. "Mommy, are we losing the farm?" Ellie opened her arms and Becca ran to her, climbing into her lap the way she had when she was small enough to carry. Ellie held her daughter, breathed in the smell of her shampoo, felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. "No, baby. Never. I promise." "How do you know?" "Because we don't owe anybody anything. The land is ours. The tractor is ours. Everything we have we own. And that means we're safe." Becca was quiet for a long moment, processing. "Mr. Caldwell's not safe." "No, he's not. Because he owes money. Because he owes more than he can pay back." Becca pulled back, looking up at her mother with those solemn eyes that saw too much, understood too young. "I'm glad we're free." Ellie kissed her daughter's forehead, holding her close. "Me too, baby. Me too." Outside, the first gray light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. The Farmall 806 sat in the shed, 17 years old and still running. The land stretched out in all directions, 480 acres of black Iowa soil that had survived droughts and floods and depression and war. It would survive this too, and so would they. Because freedom wasn't free. It cost discipline and sacrifice and saying no to everything except what mattered. It cost being laughed at and dismissed and told you were wrong. It cost working alone while everyone else worked together. But in the end, when the bills came due and the bank started calling, freedom was the only thing worth having. Ellie sat in her kitchen, holding her daughter, watching the sun rise on another day she got to decide for herself. And that was worth everything she'd given up to get it. Vernon Caldwell's auction happened on a Saturday in May, 1983, under a sky so blue it felt like mockery. Ellie didn't go. She stayed home and greased the 806 methodical and steady while half the county drove out to watch a man's life get sold piece by piece. But she sent something, an envelope with $500 cash and a note that said, "Only for the kids. Eleanor." Becca found her that evening in the shop, 8 years old now, and already learning to read the weather in her mother's face. Did Mr. Caldwell sell everything? Everything. Where will they live? Cedar Rapids. His brother-in-law got him work at the Quaker Oats plant. Production line. Becca sat on the workbench, legs swinging. Will we ever have to sell? Ellie set down her grease gun and looked at her daughter straight. No. Because we don't owe anybody. Remember that, Becca? The minute you owe, you stop deciding and start obeying. The words settled between them like a covenant. Becca nodded, solemn as a judge, and Ellie wondered how many 8-year-olds understood debt the way her daughter did. Wondered if that was a gift or a burden. Decided it was both. The feed store owner mentioned the auction on Monday when Ellie came in for mineral supplements. "Mrs. Harper, I'm surprised you're still standing. Most farms your size have folded by now." His tone suggested he wasn't sure whether to admire her or pity her. Ellie handed him exact change and met his eyes without flinching. "Still here." "Well," he counted the bills twice like he expected them to vanish. "Good for you, I guess." Outside, 2 men were loading 50-pound bags into a brand-new Dodge Ram, the kind with chrome bumpers and paint that hadn't seen a day of real work. They stopped talking when Ellie walked past, their silence louder than any words could be. She'd gotten used to it, the way conversations died when she entered a room, the way men looked at her like she was a puzzle they couldn't solve. Woman, farmer, widow, still here when so many others were gone. She drove home past fields that used to belong to the Morrison family, the Hendersons, the Pratts. All of them foreclosed now, bought up by corporate operations from Des Moines and Chicago. The land didn't care who owned it, didn't care about family names or legacy or the stories fathers told sons. It just grew what got planted and waited for someone to harvest. By 1984, 27 farms in Millbrook had gone under. The bank on Main Street added extra tellers to handle foreclosure paperwork. The John Deere dealership Hayes Farm Equipment started running sales that nobody could afford to take advantage of. Ellie saw the ads in the Millbrook Gazette: clearance prices, financing available, easy monthly payments. She turned the page without reading further. But spring that year brought something unexpected: a phone call from Brandon Hayes himself. His voice on the line sounded different than it had 6 years ago in the showroom. Smaller, uncertain. "Mrs. Harper, Brandon Hayes from the dealership. I hope I'm not bothering you." Ellie held the receiver against her ear, genuinely surprised. "What can I do for you? I was wondering, do you have time to talk? Not about buying anything. Just talk." She almost said no, almost hung up. But something in his voice stopped her, some note of desperation that sounded too familiar. "About what? How you survived, when everyone else didn't." The question landed like a stone in still water. Ellie glanced at the kitchen calendar, calculating time and priorities, and whether curiosity outweighed caution. "Why do you want to know?" "Because I'm losing the dealership, and you're the only farmer I know who's still making it." They met at the Bluebird Cafe the next afternoon, a place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting since morning. Brandon Hayes looked older than 33, should look, his face drawn, and his John Deere polo replaced by a plain white shirt with sweat stains under the arms. He stood when she entered, awkward and formal, like he'd forgotten how to be comfortable in his own skin. "Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming." Ellie slid into the booth across from him. "What's going on?" Brandon stared into his coffee cup like it held answers. "Sales are down 70%. Farmers aren't buying. They're barely maintaining. We've got $1.2 million in inventory just sitting there. My father had a stroke last month. I'm running everything alone and I don't—" His voice cracked. "I don't know what I'm doing." Ellie waited. Let the silence do its work. "In '78, when you came in for that drawbar pin, I told you that 806 was a dinosaur. Told you women didn't belong on tractors. Told you to sell." "I remember. I was wrong." Brandon's hands shook when he lifted his cup. "You're still farming. Vernon Caldwell isn't. Jim Morrison isn't. Half the county isn't. But you are. How? No debt. That's it. That's everything." Brandon set down his cup hard enough that coffee sloshed over the rim. "But that's not sustainable. You can't grow without borrowing. You can't compete without scale. Every business book says every business book was written by people who weren't betting their children's inheritance." Ellie kept her voice level, not unkind but not soft either. "You sold dreams, Brandon. Bigger tractors, bigger operations, bigger debts. And when the economy turned, those dreams became nooses. So what do I do? Cut your losses, liquidate the inventory, close the dealership, start over." Brandon's face went white. "Just give up." Giving up would have been continuing until the bank took everything. Choosing to stop is called wisdom. He laughed, bitter and broken. "My father built that dealership. It's been there 30 years. And I'm supposed to just walk away. Your father built it in different times. The world changed. You can change with it, or you can die with the old world. But you can't stop what's coming." Brandon pushed his coffee away, put his head in his hands. "I called you because I thought maybe you'd have some trick, some secret. Something I could use to save this. The secret is, there is no secret, just arithmetic. Don't spend more than you make. Don't owe more than you can pay back. Don't bet on tomorrow being better than today." She left money on the table for her coffee and stood. Brandon didn't look up, didn't say goodbye. Ellie walked out into afternoon sunlight and drove home past the dealership, its lot still full of unsold machinery gleaming under a sun that didn't care about profit margins or family legacy. 3 years later, in September 1987, Hayes Farm Equipment closed its doors for the last time. The inventory got shipped back to John Deere, the building went into foreclosure, and Brandon Hayes moved to Omaha to sell insurance. Ellie heard about it at the grain elevator, where news traveled faster than combines during harvest. She drove past the building that evening, saw the darkened windows and the weeds already starting to push through cracks in the parking lot. The place where Brandon had told her women didn't belong on tractors now belonged to the bank, waiting for someone to want it enough to make an offer. But commercial real estate in a dying farm town wasn't exactly a hot commodity. Walter Freeman's death came sudden that December, a heart attack while he was feeding cattle. They found him in the barn, peaceful as sleeping, and at the funeral, Reverend Matthews talked about a life well lived and a man well loved. Ellie sat with Becca, who was 12 now, and asking questions about mortality and meaning and what happened to farms when their farmers died. Afterward, the estate lawyer approached Ellie in the church parking lot. "Mrs. Harper, could I have a word?" They stood between cars while people filed past offering condolences to a man who had no family left to receive them. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. "Walter's will specifies that his land should be offered to you first before it goes to public auction. 160 acres adjacent to your property. Estate wants $60,000 cash, quick close, no financing." Ellie felt her heart kick against her ribs. When do they need an answer? End of the month. She drove home in silence, Becca watching her with those eyes that saw everything. When they got inside, Ellie pulled out her ledger and spread it on the kitchen table. Numbers in neat columns, 11 years of saving and sacrifice and living on what they needed instead of what they wanted. The balance showed $62,000. Becca leaned over her shoulder. "Can we buy it? If I spend $60,000, we have $2,000 left. If anything breaks, if we have a bad year, but we could, right? We have enough." Ellie looked at her daughter, saw Richard's stubbornness and her own caution mixed into something new. Saw a girl who'd grown up watching her mother choose freedom over flash security over status. Saw someone who understood that land was legacy and debt was death. Yes, we could. Then we should. And they did. In March 1988, Ellie wrote a check that emptied everything she'd saved and bought Walter Freeman's 160 acres. The land bordered hers on the north side, good black soil that had been in corn for 40 years. The deed came with a handwritten note from Walter, dated 3 months before he died. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, you bought my land. Good. You'll take care of it better than most. Don't let them break you. W.F." She taped the note to her workshop wall next to the calendar where she tracked maintenance schedules and planting dates. Every time she looked at it, she remembered the old man who'd taught her to weld, who'd believed in her when believing in women, farmers, wasn't fashionable, who'd died knowing his land would go to someone who'd honor it. Vernon Caldwell came by one evening that spring driving a rusted-out Chevy that barely ran. He'd aged a decade in the 5 years since his auction face weathered beyond his 42 years' hands softer than they should be from factory work. He stood in Ellie's driveway like he wasn't sure he had the right to be there. "Heard you bought Walter's place." Ellie was checking tire pressure on the 806. Becca reading a book in the shade of the machine shed. Seemed like the right thing to do. "Where'd you get 60,000 cash saved it?" Vernon shook his head slowly like he was working out a math problem that didn't add up. "For 11 years. While I was leveraging and expanding and being smart, you were just saving. Just saving. Diane left me." Vernon's voice was flat factual. "Took the kids to her sister's in Minnesota. I send money when I can, but factory work doesn't pay like farming did. I see them twice a year if I'm lucky." Ellie set down the tire gauge. "I'm sorry, Vernon." "Don't be." He kicked at a loose stone, sent it skittering across gravel. "I made every choice that got me here. Just funny how things work out. You doing what everyone said was wrong, me doing what everyone said was right. And here we are." He didn't wait for a response, just climbed back in his Chevy and drove away. Ellie watched until his taillights disappeared, then went back to checking tires. Becca looked up from her book. Was he mad? No. Just sad. Because he made mistakes. Because he's learning that some mistakes you can't fix. The 806 needed new tires that summer, and Ellie bought them used from an auction in Cedar Rapids. The tractor was 23 years old now, showing its age in ways that maintenance couldn't hide. The paint had faded to the color of old roses. The seat was patched with duct tape, the steering wheel cracked from decades of sun. But the engine ran smooth as silk, the hydraulics held pressure, and it pulled a 4-row planter through 480 acres every spring like clockwork. In 1990, another estate auction brought Ellie a second tractor, a 1969 John Deere 4020 with 4,800 hours, and one owner who'd maintained it religiously before the crisis took him under. She got it for $5,200, less than half what it had cost new. Green paint instead of red, but the principle was the same. Buy what others couldn't afford, pay cash, keep it running. Becca was 15 that year, old enough to drive both tractors, old enough to work full days in the field. She'd grown tall and strong, blonde hair usually pulled back in a braid, hands already developing the calluses that came from real work. Kids at school called her weird, said farming wasn't for girls, said her mother was crazy for trying to do a man's job. One afternoon, Becca came home with tears in her eyes, angry more than hurt. Ellie found her in the barn, sitting on a hay bale, fists clenched. "Tommy Briggs said you're not a real farmer, said women can't farm and you're just lucky you haven't failed yet." Ellie sat down beside her daughter. "What did you say?" "That he's wrong. That we farm 480 acres and don't owe anybody anything. That his dad lost their farm in '84 and now they rent a house in town. How'd he take that got madder? Said at least his dad tried to grow instead of staying small and scared." Ellie was quiet for a moment, choosing words carefully. "Being scared and being careful are different things, Becca. Scared people quit, careful people survive. But aren't we staying small? Couldn't we buy more land, get bigger equipment, be like the farms in the magazines? We could, if we wanted to owe the bank, if we wanted payments we couldn't miss, if we wanted to work for someone else instead of ourselves." Becca wiped her eyes. "I just hate when they look at us like we're doing it wrong. Let me tell you something, baby. In 10 years, Tommy Briggs will be working some job he hates in some city he doesn't love, and you'll be farming this land debt-free. Who's doing it wrong then?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical and true. Becca nodded slowly, anger cooling into something harder and more useful. Understanding. When Becca graduated from Millbrook High in 1993, she was valedictorian with a full scholarship to Iowa State University. She chose agricultural business, came home weekends to work the farm, studied precision agriculture and GPS systems, and no-till planting in classes taught by professors who'd never actually farmed. The disconnect between theory and practice made her restless, made her question whether everything she was learning had any value in the real world. She graduated in May 1995, 20 years old, with a degree and ideas about how farming should evolve. Came home that summer ready to implement what she'd learned, ready to modernize and optimize and drag the operation into the future. But the future cost money, and Ellie's ledger still showed the same philosophy it always had: save more than you spend, own more than you owe. The first real fight happened in June 1997, 2 years after Becca came home for good. They were in the kitchen after dinner. Becca spreading out brochures for GPS guidance systems and variable rate seeders, talking fast and excited about yield improvements and input savings. Ellie listened, washing dishes, letting her daughter build momentum before stepping in. "This system could save us 10% on seed costs alone. And the GPS means we don't overlap. Rows don't waste fertilizer. It pays for itself in 3 years. How much? 45,000 installed." Ellie dried her hands slowly. "And do we have 45,000 cash?" "No, but we could finance it. Banks are lending at 6.5%. The savings would more than cover the payments." "Becca, we don't finance." "Mom, this is 1997. Farming has changed. Everyone uses GPS now. We're falling behind. Everyone who uses GPS is making payments they can't miss. We're not falling behind. We're staying free." Becca's frustration boiled over 22 years of watching her mother say no to everything that looked like progress. "You're stuck in the past. You're farming like it's 1965. Technology exists for a reason. So does debt. Not all debt is bad. Strategic borrowing is how businesses grow. I learned this in school. You borrow when rates are low, invest in assets that appreciate, leverage your professors went bankrupt too." The question cut like a blade. Becca's face went red, then white. "That's not fair." Ellie set down the dish towel and faced her daughter straight. "Fair is you sitting in a house that's paid for on land that's owned free and clear, arguing with a mother who kept all of this together when everyone said it was impossible. Fair is you having the luxury to think about GPS systems instead of wondering how we'll make next month's payment. I'm not asking to be reckless. I'm asking to compete." "Against who?" "The corporate farms that bought up our neighbors' land. The operations running thousands of acres on credit they'll never fully pay off. Compete for what? A prize? Nobody wins." Becca's voice rose, frustration turning to anger. "For relevance, for efficiency, for being something other than the weird farm everyone pities because we're too scared to evolve." The words landed like a slap. Ellie felt something crack inside her chest, someplace where pride and hurt lived close together. Her voice came out quiet, dangerous. "Get out." "What?" "You heard me. Get out. Walk around. Think about what you just said. Come back when you can apologize." Becca stared shocked into silence. Then she turned and walked out, letting the screen door slam behind her. Ellie stood alone in the kitchen, hands shaking 21 years of single motherhood and sacrifice and grinding daily work reduced to scared in her daughter's mouth. She sat at the table, put her head in her hands, and let herself feel the weight of it. All those years of proving she could do this, proving women belonged on tractors, proving debt wasn't the only way forward. And her own daughter thought she was afraid. An hour later, the screen door opened softly. Becca came in, eyes, red face blotchy. She sat across from her mother without speaking, the kitchen table between them like a negotiating table. "I'm sorry." Ellie looked up. "For which part?" "For calling you scared. You're the bravest person I know, but you still think I'm wrong." Becca's hands twisted in her lap. "I think there's a difference between debt that destroys and debt that grows. I think we could do one new thing, just one, and see if it works. I think being careful is good, but being paralyzed is bad." Ellie considered this. Considered her daughter's education and ambition and the gap between 22 and 59. Considered that inflexibility was just another kind of death, slow and invisible. One thing, $15,000 cash. You pick. But if it fails, we go back to the old way. Deal. Becca's face transformed hope and relief and gratitude all at once. Deal. Thank you. What are you going to choose? The no-till planter. We can afford it. It'll save fuel and protect the soil, and it's something we'll use for 20 years. Ellie felt something loosen in her chest. Smart. That's thinking long-term. Learned it from someone. They bought the no-till planter in August 1997, paid cash, and used it that fall to plant cover crops. The savings on fuel alone covered 10% of the cost in the first year. Becca's professors had been right about something after all, just not about financing it. Winter of 1999 brought changes neither of them expected. Becca was 24 now, talking about boys from church and whether she wanted to stay farming or try something else. Ellie was 61, feeling her age in knees that ached in cold weather and shoulders that complained after long days on the tractor. The future was coming, whether they were ready or not. It was March 2000 when Becca came home from town with news. She'd been to the post office and the feed store and the bank doing errands, gathering information. She burst into the kitchen with an energy Ellie hadn't seen since college. "Mom, the Hayes building is for sale." Ellie looked up from her account books. "The dealership. It's been empty since '88. Bank's been trying to sell it for years. They want $185,000, but Sharon Prescott says they're desperate. They'd probably take less." "Why would we want a building in town?" "Because we need shop space. We're running 480 acres with equipment scattered in 3 different sheds. The planter's in the old barn, the combine's in the Morton building, the tractors are here. We waste half a day just moving stuff around." Ellie closed her ledger. "We don't need it, but we could use it. And think about it, that's the building where Brandon Hayes told you women couldn't farm, where he said the 806 was a dinosaur. You could own it." The suggestion sat between them, tempting and strange. Ellie thought about that day in 1978, standing at the parts counter while a young man in a polo shirt explained why she was doomed to fail. Thought about all the years since all the people who'd predicted her collapse. Thought about the building sitting empty while she kept farming. "I'll think about it." But thinking turned to driving, and the next afternoon Ellie found herself parked across the street from Hayes Farm Equipment, staring at the structure through her truck windshield. The building was solid concrete block metal roof, big overhead doors for the service bays. The parking lot was cracked and weed-choked, the windows dusty, but the bones were good. She imagined the 806 parked where Brandon's Cadillac used to sit. Imagined Becca running the operation someday, teaching her own children about debt and freedom and the difference between expansion and survival. Imagined a sign that said something other than what it used to say. A knock on her window made her jump. Sharon Prescott stood outside, bundled against March wind, smiling like she'd won the lottery. "Eleanor Harper. Thought I saw your truck. Want to look inside?" Sharon was 45, a realtor who'd survived the farm crisis by selling foreclosed properties to corporate buyers. She'd grown up in Millbrook, knew everyone, and had learned to read people the way farmers read weather. They walked through the building together, footsteps echoing in empty service bays. The space was bigger than Ellie remembered, ceiling high enough for combines, electrical updated sometime in the '80s, concrete floors with drains for oil changes. The offices in front were dated but functional, paneling dark, and carpet stained but not beyond repair. Banks asking $185. Sharon pulled out a folder thick with paperwork. "But between you and me, they'd take less. Building's been empty 12 years. They're paying taxes and insurance and getting nothing." "How much less?" "Make an offer, and we'll find out." Ellie walked through the showroom where she'd stood with 3-year-old Becca, where Brandon had smiled his salesman smile and told her she was farming with dinosaurs. The memory had teeth still sharp after 22 years. She thought about all the farmers who'd bought equipment here, signed financing papers, shook hands on deals that would destroy them. Thought about the machinery that had rolled out of these bays shining and new and mortgaged to the gills. 120. Cash. 30-day close. Sharon's eyebrows went up. "That's $65,000 under asking. Building's been empty 12 years. That's what I'm offering. Let me call the bank." They walked outside while Sharon made the call, standing in the weedy parking lot where Ellie had parked her rusty truck next to rows of gleaming new equipment. Sharon talked low and fast, professional charm working its magic. When she hung up, she was shaking her head. They said no, but they countered at 165. 120. "That's my number." Sharon looked at her, calculating. "You serious? I don't make offers I'm not serious about. This could take a while. Banks don't like leaving money on the table. Then they can keep paying taxes on an empty building. I'll wait." Over the next 3 months, Ellie and the bank danced the dance of people who both needed something, but only one of them was willing to wait. The bank came down to 155. Ellie stayed at 120. The bank dropped to 145. Ellie didn't move. By June, Sharon called with a different tone in her voice. "They'll take 130. Cash. As is. Close in 3 weeks." Ellie was in the field when she got the call, Becca running the 4020 in the adjacent rows. She killed the engine on the 806 and sat in the sudden silence, phone pressed to her ear, heartbeat loud in her chest. "Tell them 125. Final offer." Eleanor. 125. Sharon. "Or I walk." 2 days later, Sharon called back. They took it. Ellie sat at her kitchen table that night, checkbook open, pen in hand. The account showed $143,000. Buying the building would leave her with $18,000. Less than she'd had when she started. Less cushion than she had ever operated with. But the building would consolidate. Everything would give Becca room to grow. The operation would put the 806 under the same roof where it had been called obsolete. She thought about Brandon Hayes wherever he was now. Thought about Vernon Caldwell in his factory job. Thought about all the farmers who'd walked through those doors believing debt was smart and expansion was mandatory. Thought about being the woman who'd outlasted all of them. Becca came in from evening chores, saw the checkbook, understood immediately. "You're doing it. Not doing. Done. We close next week." Becca sat down hard, like her legs had stopped working. "We own it. The dealership. We will." "Mom." Becca's voice broke. "That's where they... I know. You're buying the building where they told you you'd fail." Ellie signed the check, her handwriting steady and sure, tore it from the book and set it aside. Sometimes the best revenge is just staying in business long enough to buy the place where someone wrote you off. The closing happened on July 7, 2000 in a lawyer's office that smelled like old paper and air conditioning. Ellie signed documents, handed over the check, received keys and a deed and a handshake from a bank officer who didn't remember her from 1978. Sharon Prescott smiled like she'd done something noble instead of just collecting a commission. Outside, Ellie stood on the sidewalk holding keys to a building she never thought she'd own. Becca stood beside her, 25 years old now, strong and capable and ready to take over someday. The summer sun beat down on Millbrook's Main Street, baking the asphalt, making heat shimmer rise like promises. "You did it. We did it," Ellie corrected her. "This is yours as much as mine." They drove to the building, unlocked the front door, walked into the space that now belonged to them. Dust motes floated in shafts of sunlight coming through dirty windows. The air smelled like abandonment and possibility in equal measure. Becca walked straight to the service bay where the 806 would go, stood in the rectangle of afternoon light and turned in a slow circle. "We could put the planter over there. Combine in the far bay. Tool benches along that wall. Office upstairs for records." Ellie watched her daughter plan the future, saw Richard in the angle of her jaw, and herself in the careful calculation of space and storage, saw a farmer being born out of everything they'd survived together. "What should we call it?" Becca didn't hesitate. "Jenkins Farm Equipment Storage, not Harper." You earned this more than Dad did. You should name it. Ellie thought about that. Thought about Richard dying before he could see what his widow would become. Thought about being Eleanor Harper for 62 years carrying his name because that's what women did. Thought about Becca someday marrying and changing her name again the way generations of women had erased themselves one marriage at a time. Harper Jenkins. Both of us. Both names. Becca smiled. I like that better. They locked up as the sun started its descent, turning the sky colors that had no names. Ellie drove home, past fields she owned, past land she'd saved for past the life she'd built, one careful decision at a time. The 806 sat in her old shed waiting to be moved. 22 years since Brandon Hayes called it a dinosaur. 35 years since it rolled off the assembly line. Tomorrow they'd start moving equipment. Tomorrow the building would stop being Hayes Farm Equipment and start being something new. But tonight, Ellie sat on her porch and watched darkness gather over Iowa farmland that had survived depression and drought, and the worst agricultural crisis in 50 years. Becca brought out 2 beers, something they did now that her daughter was old enough to drink legally. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to evening sounds, crickets, and distant highway traffic and the wind moving through corn that was knee-high and green. Think we'll make it another 20 years? Ellie considered the question seriously. Considered her age and her knees and the way the world kept changing. Considered Becca's education and ambition and the gap between what was and what could be. I think you will. Mom. We will. Ellie clinked her bottle against her daughter's. We will. And in the gathering dark, with the smell of earth and growing things rising around them, Eleanor Harper believed it might even be true. Moving equipment into Harper Jenkins Farm, equipment storage took 3 weeks in August 2000. Ellie and Becca worked from sunrise to dusk, hauling the 806 and the 4020 on a flatbed trailer borrowed from the co-op, relocating the planter and combine and all the accumulated tools of 34 years farming. The building swallowed it all and still had room which felt both luxurious and slightly obscene after decades of making do with whatever space they could scrounge. Becca swept out the old showroom, finding sales brochures from 1987 still stacked in a corner cabinet. John Deere 4450s and 4650s, tractors that cost $60,000 new and bankrupted the men who bought them. She threw them all in the dumpster without reading past the first page. The 806 went into the service bay closest to the offices, the spot where Brandon Hayes used to park his Cadillac Eldorado before the world collapsed around him. Ellie backed it in slowly, careful not to scratch paint on door frames, and when she shut off the engine, the silence felt significant. 35 years old now, this tractor. Still starting every morning, still pulling implements through black Iowa soil, still proving that survival mattered more than flash. They cleaned and organized through September, installing pegboards for tools, building shelves for parts, creating a system that made sense. The old dealership became something new, something that served them, instead of demanding they serve it. Ellie found herself spending evenings in the upstairs office, a space with windows overlooking Main Street, working on account books while Becca tinkered in the bays below. It was October when Becca called up the stairs, voice strange and tight. Mom, you need to see this. Ellie descended to find her daughter standing in what had been Brandon's private office, holding a cardboard box she'd pulled from a built-in cabinet. The box was full of papers, invoices, loan statements, foreclosure notices dating from 1986 and 87, financial death documented in triplicate. But Becca wasn't looking at the business records. She was holding a single sheet of paper, handwritten, creased from being folded and unfolded multiple times. It's a letter. To you. Ellie took it, recognizing the letterhead even before she read the words. Hayes Farm Equipment, with an address and phone number that no longer existed. Brandon's handwriting was neat, almost careful, like he'd taken time to get it right. Mrs. Harper. I doubt you remember me, but I remember you. March 1978. I was an arrogant kid who thought I knew everything. You were the widow with the old red tractor who needed an $8 pin. I told you that tractor was a dinosaur, that you couldn't compete with 1960s equipment, that women didn't belong on tractors, that you should sell before you failed. I was wrong, completely catastrophically wrong. My father's dealership is closing this month. We're $400,000 in debt to suppliers and the bank. I'm moving to Omaha to sell insurance. Meanwhile, I drive past your farm every week, and that red tractor is still there, still working. You were right. I was wrong. I'm sorry I never had the courage to tell you in person. Brandon Hayes. September 1987. The date was 13 years old. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. The return address on the envelope showed it had never been mailed, just written, sealed, and hidden in a cabinet where no one would find it until the building changed hands. Ellie read it twice, then a third time. Felt something shift in her chest, some weight she hadn't known she was carrying. All those years of being dismissed, of being told she was wrong, of watching men fail while insisting their way was better. And here was proof that at least one of them had learned. Had admitted it. Had written it down even if he couldn't bring himself to send it. Becca was watching her face. You okay? Ellie folded the letter carefully, creased it along the original lines. I don't know what I am. Are you going to try to find him? The question hung between them. Ellie thought about Omaha, about insurance salesmen and second chances, and whether 13 years was too long to acknowledge an apology that had been written but never delivered. Thought about Brandon Hayes at 27, confident and cruel, and Brandon Hayes at 40, broken enough to write truth he couldn't speak. I don't know that either. But the letter stayed with her. She put it in her desk drawer, pulled it out sometimes when the weight of the past felt particularly heavy. Wondered what it had cost him to write those words. Wondered if he still thought about that day in the dealership, the widow and the toddler and the drawbar pin, worth $8.65. Winter came and went. Spring 2001 brought planting season and all the familiar rhythms of working soil. Becca turned 26 in April, talking about a boy from the implement co-op named Thomas Whitmore, testing the waters of whether her mother would approve of romance when there was always so much work to do. Ellie approved quietly and without fuss because Becca deserved happiness beyond these 480 acres. The phone call came in August mid-afternoon on a Tuesday when the corn was shoulder high and the soybeans were flowering. Ellie was in the shop changing oil on the 4020 when Becca brought her the cordless phone hand over the mouthpiece. It's Brandon Hayes. Ellie's heart kicked. She wiped her hands on a rag. Took the phone, walked outside where the signal was better. Brandon's voice came through the line, sounding older than 50 should sound, worn down by years she knew nothing about. Mrs. Harper, I hope I'm not bothering you. What can I do for you, Brandon? He was quiet for a moment, gathering courage or organizing thoughts or both. I heard you bought the building, the dealership. Sharon Prescott mentioned it when I was back visiting my father's grave last month. We did. Last summer. I wanted to... He stopped, started again. Could we talk? In person? I'm driving through Millbrook next week on my way to Des Moines. I'd like to buy you coffee, if you're willing. Ellie looked at the building, at the sign Becca had mounted over the main doors. Harper Jenkins Farm Equipment Storage. Looked at the parking lot where weeds had grown through asphalt, where she'd parked her rusty truck next to gleaming new machinery 23 years ago. Looked at all of it and felt something like curiosity mixed with something like mercy. Bluebird Cafe. Thursday at 2. Thank you. I'll be there. Thursday arrived hot and humid, the kind of August day that made air feel thick as water. Ellie, dressed in clean jeans and a blouse that wasn't stained with grease, drove to town in the same F-100 she'd driven in 1978, parked in front of the cafe, and sat for a moment preparing herself for whatever this was going to be. Brandon was already inside, sitting in a booth near the window. 50 years old now, hair gone mostly gray, face lined in ways that suggested worry more than age. He wore khakis and a button-down shirt, insurance salesman clothes, and when he stood to greet her, his handshake was firm but not aggressive. Mrs. Harper, thank you for coming. Ellie slid into the booth across from him. Call me Eleanor. His surprise showed. Eleanor. Thank you. They ordered coffee. Neither of them would drink, and for a moment they just sat there. Two people who'd last spoken when one was 27 and certain and the other was 40 and dismissed. The silence stretched until Brandon broke it, words coming out in a rush like he'd been holding them for years. I heard you found my letter. Ellie kept her face neutral. I did. I wrote it the day we closed. September 15th, 1987. Sat in my office after the bank took the keys and wrote everything I'd been too proud to say. Then I couldn't send it. Couldn't face you after being so, his voice cracked, after being so cruel. Why now? Why call after 13 years? Brandon took a breath, steadying himself. Because I've been teaching. High school business classes in Omaha since 1991. Started as a way to make ends meet while selling insurance, ended up preferring it. Last month, a girl in my junior class asked me what the biggest mistake of my career was. And I told her about you, about me, about the widow who came into my dealership with a 3-year-old daughter and an old tractor, about how I told her she couldn't compete, couldn't succeed, should sell before she failed, about how I was wrong and she was right, and I spent the next 13 years watching farmers who followed my advice go bankrupt while you kept farming. The words settled between them like stones dropped in deep water. Ellie felt her throat tighten, felt tears threatening for reasons she couldn't quite name. All those years of being right hadn't erased the sting of being dismissed. Vindication didn't heal old wounds, just proved they'd been justified. "What did your student say?" She asked if I ever apologized, and I had to tell her no, that I wrote a letter I never sent, that I've been a coward for 13 years. And now you're here. Brandon's eyes were wet. Now I'm here, asking if it's too late to say I'm sorry, to tell you that you were the strongest person I ever met, and I was too stupid to see it. To admit that watching you survive taught me more about farming than my father's 30 years in the business ever did. Ellie looked at him. Really looked. Saw the regret carved into the lines around his mouth, saw the weight of failure in the slope of his shoulders. Saw someone who'd learned the hardest way possible that being certain and being right were different things. She thought about staying angry about making him suffer the way she'd suffered. But anger was exhausting and she'd spent enough years carrying it. "I forgive you." The words came out simpler than she'd expected, cleaner. Brandon's face crumpled, tears spilling over before he could stop them. He put his face in his hands and wept, shoulders shaking, making sounds that had no pride left in them. Ellie sat across from him and let him have his moment, understanding that some griefs needed witnessing. When he could speak again, his voice was ragged. How do you forgive me after what I said, after how I treated you, because I already did. Years ago. Anger takes energy I needed for farming. And besides," she paused, choosing words carefully, "you were a product of your time. Most men thought like you did. Most still do. The difference is you learned. You admitted you were wrong. That's rarer than you think. I tell my students about you every semester. The strongest farmer I ever knew was a woman. That's what I say. And they don't believe me at first because they've been taught the same lies I was taught. But then I show them the math. Show them how debt destroys. Show them that the widow with the old tractor outlasted everyone who laughed at her. What's her name? This farmer you talk about? Brandon met her eyes. Eleanor Harper. The woman who proved me wrong and saved me from repeating my father's mistakes. They sat in that truth for a long moment. Outside, Millbrook went about its business, trucks rolling past farmers, stopping for supplies, life continuing in all the ordinary ways. Inside, two people who'd started as antagonist and victim found something like understanding in the space between what was and what could be. "Can I show you something?" Ellie pulled the letter from her purse, unfolded it on the table between them. I kept it. Brandon stared at his own handwriting like he was seeing a ghost. Why? Because it mattered. Because someone finally saw the truth. Because even though you couldn't send it, you wrote it down. That took courage too. Not enough courage. Ellie refolded the letter, slid it across the table. "Keep it. You wrote it. It's yours." Brandon picked it up with shaking hands. "Eleanor, would you like to see the building? What we've done with it?" His face transformed, grief giving way to something like hope. "I'd like that very much." They walked the 2 blocks to Harper Jenkins' farm equipment storage in afternoon heat that made the air shimmer. Brandon moved slowly like he was walking through a museum of his own past, seeing ghosts in every doorway. When Ellie unlocked the main entrance, he stopped at the threshold. "I haven't been inside since the day we closed. A lot has changed." They walked through the space together, Ellie explaining what went where, how they'd reorganized the bays, what improvements they'd made. Brandon listened, nodded, asked questions that showed he still understood the bones of the place, even if the purpose had shifted. When they reached the service bay where the 806 sat, he stopped walking. "It's still here, still running." Brandon approached the tractor slowly, reverently, like approaching an altar. Put his hand on the hood where paint had faded to the color of old roses. The metal was warm from sitting in the sun, and his palm left a print in the dust. "I called this a dinosaur. Dinosaurs went extinct. We didn't. The line landed between them, simple and undeniable. Brandon looked at her, understanding everything that sentence contained, looked back at the tractor, at the machine that had outlasted his certainty, outlasted his dealership, outlasted every prediction he'd made. How many hours does it have now? 22,000. We rebuilt the engine in 91. Becca did most of the work herself. Your daughter farms. My daughter will run this operation someday. All of it, debt-free. Brandon walked around the 806, taking in the patched seat and cracked steering wheel and all the small signs of decades of use. Touched the exhaust stack that Ellie still polished every week because some traditions mattered. Looked at the tires she'd replaced 6 times, the hydraulic lines she'd rebuilt, the oil filter she changed religiously. Everything I told you was wrong. About women, about equipment, about debt, all of it. You were young. Young people are often wrong. I destroyed families, sold them dreams they couldn't afford, took commissions while they signed away their futures. Ellie's voice was firm but not unkind. You didn't destroy them. The system did. You were just part of it. But you learned. You changed. You're teaching now, warning students away from the same mistakes. That's redemption, Brandon. That's how you make amends. He turned to face her, and something in his expression had shifted. The guilt was still there, but underneath it was something harder, something like determination. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you hate me? The question hung in the space between them, honest and raw. Ellie thought about hate, about all the ways it could poison a person from the inside. Thought about the years she'd spent proving Brandon wrong, proving she belonged, proving women could farm. Thought about whether any of that was about him or about herself. No, I never did. You were young and wrong. That's not a crime. Cruelty was just what salesmen were taught to use. But you're not that person anymore. And holding on to anger at who you were doesn't serve who you are. What you did, surviving, succeeding, outlasting everyone that serves a purpose, it serves Becca. It serves every girl who's been told she can't. It serves the truth that being careful beats being fast. Beyond that, I don't know what it serves. I just know I'm still here. That matters more than you know. They walked back toward the front, past tools hung on pegboards and parts organized in labeled bins, and all the small improvements that came from actually using a space instead of just selling from it. Near the door, Brandon paused, looking at the empty showroom floor where tractors used to gleam under fluorescent lights. This is where you stood, with your daughter, asking for a pin. This is where you told me women don't belong on tractors. I was so sure, so absolutely certain I knew better. Ellie opened the door, letting in afternoon heat and the sound of traffic. Certainty is just another word for not listening. They stood on the sidewalk outside the conversation, winding down, both of them feeling the weight of it. Brandon extended his hand and Ellie took it. The handshake longer than strictly necessary, carrying meaning that words couldn't quite hold. Thank you, Eleanor, for forgiving me, for teaching me, for being exactly who you are. Thank you for learning. He walked to his car, a sensible Honda with Omaha plates, and Ellie watched him drive away, watched until his taillights disappeared around the corner near the grain elevator, taking with them the last remnants of anger she'd been carrying since 1978. Forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, didn't mean what he'd said hadn't hurt, just meant refusing to let hurt define the rest of her life. Becca found her an hour later, still standing outside the building watching evening traffic. Mom, you okay? Brandon came by. We talked. And I forgave him, because holding on to it was heavier than letting it go. Becca put her arm around her mother's shoulders. Was it hard? Easier than I expected. Anger's just exhausting, baby. At some point you realize it's taking more than it's giving. They walked back inside together, mother and daughter, 63 and 26, carrying between them the knowledge that some battles ended not with victory, but with understanding. The 806 sat in its bay, red and patient, and still running a monument to the idea that survival was its own kind of triumph. The years turned. Becca married Thomas Whitmore in 2002, a quiet ceremony at the Methodist Church followed by a reception in the Harper Jenkins building because it was the biggest space they owned. Ellie danced with her daughter to a song she didn't recognize, feeling Richard's absence like a physical presence, wishing he could see what their little girl had become. The farm expanded again in 2007 when the Hendrickson place went up for sale. Another 160 acres adjacent to theirs, bought for cash, saved over 7 years of good harvests and careful spending. 640 acres now all paid for, all owned free and clear. The math stayed the same: save more than you spend, own more than you owe. Never bet tomorrow on today's optimism. Becca's daughter arrived in December 2007, 9 pounds of squalling red-faced fury that they named Lily, because Becca had always loved flowers, and Thomas didn't care what they called her as long as she was healthy. Ellie became a grandmother at 69, holding her granddaughter, and seeing in her face the echo of Richard, the ghost of herself, the promise of continuity. But age came regardless of whether anyone wanted it. Ellie's knees went bad in 2015, required surgery that took her off the tractor for 6 months. Her hands developed arthritis that made small work painful. She started sleeping later, moving slower, needing help with tasks she'd done alone for 40 years. The transition from operator to advisor happened so gradually she barely noticed, until one day Becca was running everything and Ellie was the one asking how things were going. They added 80 more acres in 2018, a strange landlocked parcel that came up when old Edgar Sullivan died without heirs. 720 acres total, an operation that would have been unthinkable when Ellie started. But unthinkable didn't mean impossible. Just meant working longer and smarter and never ever owing anyone anything you couldn't pay back tomorrow. Ellie died in May 2023 at 85, peacefully in her sleep, after a day spent watching Lily practice backing the 4020 into the equipment shed. She'd lived to see her granddaughter turn 15, to see Becca running an operation that supported 2 families without a dollar of debt, to see the 806 turn 58 and still running. The obituary in the Millbrook Gazette was brief. Eleanor Harper Farmer, survived by daughter Rebecca Whitmore and granddaughter Lily Whitmore. Service is private. In lieu of flowers, plant something that lasts. They buried her next to Richard in the cemetery behind the Methodist church, under oak trees that had been saplings when she started farming. Becca spoke at the funeral, her voice steady even as tears ran down her face. She talked about her mother's stubbornness and wisdom and refusal to quit, even when quitting would have been easier. Talked about learning to farm by watching a woman who wasn't supposed to be able to farm. Talked about legacy measured not in acres, but in autonomy. 2 years later, in August 2025, a young woman named Kate Sullivan walked into Harper Jenkins Farm Equipment Storage, carrying a business plan and hope in equal measure. She was 25, fresh out of ag school, blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing work boots that still had the shine of newness. Becca was in the main bay with Lily, teaching her granddaughter the proper way to torque lug nuts on the 4020's front wheel. "Ms. Whitmore, I'm Kate Sullivan. I called last week." Becca straightened, wiping her hands on a rag. Lily stayed where she was, 18 now, and learning everything her mother and grandmother could teach. "Come on in. What can we help you with?" Kate glanced at Lily, then back to Becca. "I wanted advice about expanding my family's operation." "My dad," she paused, something painful crossing her face. "My dad lost our farm in '84. I was born after. But he left me 160 acres he'd bought back piece by piece, working factory jobs. Took him 30 years. And now I want to make it bigger. Make it work the way he always dreamed it could." Becca exchanged a look with Lily. "What are you thinking?" Kate spread out her business plan on a workbench, pointing to projections and loan schedules and growth curves that promised success if she could just get financing. Banks offering 6.2%. "That's good, right? Better than most farmers get. I could go from 160 to 400 acres. Modern equipment, GPS systems. Be competitive." Lily spoke up, her voice younger than Becca's had been at that age, but carrying the same skepticism. "How much total?" "200,000. For land, equipment, upgrades, operating expenses." Becca looked at the numbers, saw the familiar shape of debt dressed up in professional language. Saw a young woman eager to expand, to compete, to prove she could farm as big as the corporate operations buying up the county. Saw herself at 25 ready to modernize until her mother taught her that new and better weren't synonyms. Saw something else too. Saw Kate's last name, Sullivan, and remembered a farmer from the '80s who'd gone under. Wondered if this was his daughter, if history was trying to repeat itself. "What's your current debt?" Kate's chin lifted proud. "None. Dad made sure of that. Said he'd rather leave me 160 acres free and clear than 640 acres mortgaged. Becca felt something shift in her chest. Your father was smart. He was a factory worker who dreamed of farming. Kate's voice held defiance and grief. I want to honor that. Make his sacrifice worth something. Come with me. Becca nodded toward the back bay, and Kate followed. Lily came too quiet and observant, learning the way Becca had learned, by watching, by listening, by understanding that some lessons couldn't be taught, only witnessed. The 806 sat exactly where it always sat, patient and permanent, 60 years of history made metal. The paint was almost entirely pink now, sun-faded beyond recognition. The seat held together with duct tape and faith. But the engine, rebuilt 4 times by 3 generations of women, still turned over clean as a bell. Kate looked at it, trying to understand what she was supposed to see. That's old. 60 years old. Becca put her hand on the hood, the metal warm from afternoon sun. In 1978, a man in this building told my grandmother women couldn't farm, that this tractor was obsolete, that she should sell before she failed. Lily picked up the story, her voice carrying the weight of family history. What happened to him? Kate looked between them, processing. He went bankrupt. His dealership closed in 1987. Becca gestured around them. This building. My grandmother bought it in 2000. Bought the place where they told her she couldn't succeed. And the tractor, still running. Lily walked to the exhaust stack, began polishing it with a rag she pulled from her pocket. Because Grandma Eleanor never owed anybody anything she couldn't pay back tomorrow. Kate stared at the 806, working through implications. But you can't compete with old equipment. The big farms have payments they can't miss. Becca's voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone passing down truth that had been earned through decades of refusal. This land is mine. Not the bank's. Mine. When crops fail or prices drop or equipment breaks, I fix it and keep going. If I owed $200,000 at 6.2%, that's $12,400 in interest alone every year before I touch the principal, before I eat or pay property tax or replace a single part. But if I don't expand... Kate, can I ask you something? What happened to your dad's first farm? The one he lost. Kate's face went tight. Debt. He borrowed to expand in 82. Interest rates went to 20%. Bank foreclosed in 84. He spent the next 30 years buying back 160 acres, one piece at a time, working double shifts, saving every dollar. He died last year, never having farmed again. And I thought, she stopped, voice breaking, I thought I could do it right, make his dream real, by repeating his mistake. The question hung in the air. Kate looked at her business plan, at the numbers that promised success, at the debt that would make it all possible. Looked at the 806 that had outlasted certainty and expansion and every prediction thrown against it. What should I do? Becca glanced at Lily, saw her daughter watching with those eyes that missed nothing, saw in her face the same question Becca had asked her mother 28 years ago, saw the moment when understanding would click or wouldn't. That's not for me to say. But I'll tell you what my mother told me. Farm the 160 you have. Save every dollar you don't need to spend. Fix things instead of replacing them. And when you have cash to expand, then expand. But never ever owe what you can't pay back tomorrow. That could take years. Lily spoke up, surprising them both. Grandma took 11 years to save for Walter Freeman's land. Mom took 7 years to save for the Hendrickson place. We just bought the Sullivan parcel last year, took 6 years to save for it. Slow doesn't mean wrong. Kate looked at Lily, really looked. You're 18. Learning to farm the way my mom and grandma did. No debt, no payments, no one telling us what we have to do. The weight of it settled over Kate like a revelation. She looked at her business plan again, at the projections and promises, then back at the 806. Something shifted in her face, some decision being made or unmade. Can I think about it? Of course. Becca handed her a card with the Harper Jenkins number. If you want to talk more, call. And Kate, your dad would be proud you came here first, that you asked before you signed. Kate nodded, not trusting her voice, and left carrying her business plan and a different kind of hope than she'd arrived with. After she was gone, Lily turned to her mother. Think she'll listen? Becca watched through the window as Kate's truck pulled away. I don't know. Some people have to learn by losing, but at least we tried. Is that what Grandma would have done? Becca put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. Your grandma would have told her the truth and let her choose. That's all we can do. The rest is up to Kate. They stood together in the service bay, 3 generations of knowledge compressed into a moment. Lily looked at the 806, really looked at it for maybe the first time. Not just an old tractor, but a testament. Not obsolete, but essential. Not a dinosaur, but proof that some things outlasted flash and speed and the certainty of young men in polo shirts. Mom. Yeah, baby. Are we ever going to buy a new tractor? Becca considered the question. Considered what Ellie would say, what Richard would have said, what 3 generations of survival had taught them. When we need one, we can pay cash for. Not before. That could be years, could be, or it could be never. This equipment works. Why replace something that isn't broken just to have something newer? Lily thought about that, turning it over the way teenagers did when adults contradicted everything they'd learned about progress and technology and keeping up. Because everyone else has new equipment, everyone else has payments. We have autonomy. Which would you rather have? The question wasn't rhetorical. Becca waited, watching her daughter work through it, seeing the exact moment understanding clicked into place, seeing Ellie's wisdom pass down one more generation. Autonomy. Lily's voice was certain. Definitely autonomy. Then we keep the old equipment, and we keep farming the way we've always farmed. And someday when I'm gone and this is yours, you'll have the same choice. And whatever you choose, you'll live with it. I'll choose what you chose, what Grandma chose. Becca felt tears threaten but pushed them down. Maybe, or maybe you'll find a third way, but you'll find it without owing anyone. That evening, after Lily had gone inside for dinner, Becca stayed in the shop. She climbed into the 806's seat, her mother's seat, her grandmother's seat, worn smooth by 3 generations of women who'd been told they couldn't and proved they could. Put her hands on the steering wheel, feeling the cracks in the plastic, the history in every groove. She turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught and rumbled to life. 60 years old and still starting, still running, still working, still proving that careful beat fast, that patient outlasted flashy, that owning mattered more than impressing. Becca let it idle, listening to the rhythm she'd known her entire life. Thought about her mother dying peacefully. Thought about her daughter learning to farm. Thought about Kate Sullivan and whether she'd choose wisdom or repetition. Thought about all the women who'd sat in this seat, hands on this wheel, making the choice to survive instead of the choice to shine. Outside, night was falling over Iowa farmland that had survived everything history could throw at it. Inside, a red tractor ran steady as a heartbeat, carrying in its very existence proof that some things, careful things, maintained things, owned things, lasted longer than anyone believed possible. Tomorrow they'd check the hydraulics. Tomorrow Lily would practice parallel parking the grain wagon. Tomorrow the work would continue the way it had continued for 47 years since a widow walked into a dealership and got told women didn't belong on tractors. But tonight, Becca sat in her grandmother's legacy and her mother's inheritance and her daughter's future, feeling the weight of it all settle around her shoulders like a promise kept. The 806 rumbled on, 60 years old and still running, still here, still working, still proving that the only asset that never depreciated was the one you owned outright. Becca killed the engine and sat in the sudden silence. Through the window she could see lights coming on in houses across Millbrook, families settling in for the evening, the ordinary rhythms of small-town life. Tomorrow Kate Sullivan would make her choice. Tomorrow someone else would come asking for advice. Tomorrow the cycle would continue. But the answer would always be the same, simple and true and earned through 3 generations of refusal. Don't owe what you can't pay back. Own what you run. Save what you can. The rest was just details. Becca locked up the building and drove home past fields that stretched to darkness, past 720 acres of black Iowa soil that belonged to her completely. No bank owned it. No one could take it away. And that singular truth her grandmother had built and her mother had protected and she would pass to Lily was worth more than all the new equipment and expansion and competition in the world. She parked next to the farmhouse where Ellie had raised Becca, where Becca had raised Lily, where someday Lily might raise children of her own. The porch light was on. Lily stood silhouetted in the doorway waiting. Think Kate will call? Becca climbed the steps, put her arm around her daughter. I think she'll think about it, and that's all we can ask. What if she doesn't listen? Then she'll learn. One way or another, everyone learns. The question is just whether they learn by watching or by losing. They walked inside together, leaving the night to the fields and the stars, and the 806 sitting in its bay 2 miles away. Still there, still running, still carrying the truth that had sustained 3 generations of women who'd been told they couldn't and chose to prove they could. In the kitchen, dinner waited. The ledger sat on the table, numbers in neat columns showing income and expenses, and the 0 in the debt column that had been there for 47 years. Outside, the wind moved through corn that was waist-high and green, growing toward harvest, growing toward a future that nobody could predict, but everyone could prepare for. By choosing caution over speed, by choosing ownership over appearance, by choosing to be the last one standing instead of the first one to expand. Becca opened the ledger and made her nightly entry, the ritual her grandmother had started and her mother had continued. Every dollar accounted for, every debt still 0. Every day another proof that survival beat flash every single time. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight they were safe. Tonight they were free. Tonight they owned every acre and every machine and every decision, and that was the only wealth that mattered. The rest was just equipment. And equipment, if you maintained it, lasted longer than anyone believed possible.